Hello, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. Hopefully the Zoom and so on is working fine. And let me begin by saying a very big welcome to everybody, wherever you are at the moment and however positioned you are. I'm very much pleased to see you all here today. My name is Jeff Ross. I am one of the conference directors for the Beyond Multiple Choice conference stream, and I'm going to kick off with a few bits of administration before we start the conference with our esteemed speaker, Professor Ian Kinchin, in a few moments. We've got a very full program of presentations, demonstrations, discussions over the next 3 days, and I'll just give you a brief run through of those in a moment. But let me begin by thanking all our speakers and contributors today, tomorrow, and on day 3 of the conference. And also a big thanks to our sponsors who have made all of this possible. And finally, to the technical team in the States and my colleagues there who have brought this broadcast to life today.
I think we open in both.
Technical glitch, sorry about that. So without further ado, let me switch over to my slide deck. Hopefully this should be coming through. Yes, it's now told me that you should be able to see this. So we're going to try and make the next 3 days as interactive as possible, please. We welcome your comments and contributions via social media at BMC Assessments and hashtag BMC 2022, and we're also on LinkedIn. And predominantly through the next 3 days, we'll be using the Zoom chat function in order for you to be able to ask us questions, to put queries to the speakers and the contributors, to make comments, to challenge, to contribute. We want this to be as interactive as possible, and for it to be your conference and to be as much your involvement in this as our very fine lineup of speakers over the next few days. These are our sponsors. It's them that have made this possible by allowing us to offer free registration to everybody. And a big thank you to them for their foresight and their generosity in making the conference possible. So thank you to TAL, Certified, Reta, Civica, Surpass, Zero, Assessment Tomorrow, and so on. Their support is very, very, very much appreciated. We have a very wide audience today coming from across the globe. For some of people will be watching this in the wee small hours of the night, or watching this on catch up. The conference will be recorded. We will be sending out a link after the conference is over, which will give you the ability to either watch the conference for the first time on catch up, or to just review and view some of the presentations, or all the presentations again, as you wish, as you need and require. So there we are across the world, and I think it's a reflection of the importance of the subject that we managed to draw correspondents and delegates from all continents on the globe. So the overview for today, before we go any further, is that we will start with a keynote in a minute or two. That will be followed by a special session, and then we'll go into session 1. We'll then take a break for 30 minutes, let people catch up with their emails and all of that sort of thing. And we'll then come back, meet back, slight change in program, but I'll talk about that later on. A slightly different special session today as session 5. Then we have the panel discussion, and I'll lead on to that later on this afternoon and let you all follow in from that and hopefully contribute and join in our panelists today. And we're planning, we're hoping to end at 3 p.m. Eastern time today. And I will try and keep, when I refer to times throughout today, I'll keep to Eastern time if that's okay with everybody. That will give us a thread through it, although I do understand there are people in the Philippines I see logged on a moment who must be in the, almost at midnight, if not beyond that. We'll try and keep to the times in Eastern time as we progress through the course of today, tomorrow, and the day after. Ask questions, use the chat box, as I said, #BMC 2022 or at BMC assessments for social media. And with that, I'm going to take the conference into its first and proper session of the day. So I'm going to invite Professor Ian Kinchin, Professor of Higher Education at University of Surrey here in the UK, where I'm based, and perhaps I should have said that earlier. Ian has worked to support professional development of university teachers for the past two decades. He's a very well-respected and well-known voice, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing him and what he has to say on the subject of linearity and binary thinking as obstacles to educational innovation, the whole subject of innovation. What I'll do is in a few seconds, I will stop sharing this screen, invite Ian to step forward digitally, if you can step forward digitally. I shall invite him to do so. He will then give us his presentation, and then we'll take some questions and answers at the end. And I'm sure there'll be lots of them. As I said before already, please use the chat box to let them flow, and your comments and queries and whatever challenges and so on. And we'll take those as a session, question and answers after Ian's presentation. So I will now stop sharing, bring it back onto my screen. I can see that Ian's there already. And with no further ado, I shall leave you in Ian's very capable hands. Over to you, Ian.
Thank you very much for that. I seem to be here twice. I don't know if that's going to cause a problem. I've got an echo on my end, Jeff. I don't know if that's affecting other people.
Ian, I think you're fine. Go ahead.
Okay. I will share my screen with you. There we go. And I'll start by saying good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you very much for coming to this session. So I'm talking about linear and binary thinking as obstacles to education and innovation. Okay, is that okay? There's a recording has just interrupted the slides. Is it still okay for you, Brian? It's gone haywire.
Yeah. Do you have two machines running?
No.
Okay. I'm not
We've
sure
lost Brian. We've lost Ian's second link, so I think that should clear itself up now.
Yeah, go ahead, Ian.
Okay, thank you. So linear and binary thinking, and this is drawing on my research for the last few years. And a lot of this is, I'm sorry, the system has gone haywire. Flashing lights.
Ian, we are getting feedback. I'm trying to fix it. If you can just proceed, try to work through it.
Things are not moving forward now. It's frozen on me.
You're not able to advance your slides, Ian?
It's not, no, it's stuck.
Okay, I think the issue's on your side, but
I've only got one computer open.
can you stop sharing and try to reshare?
Okay, does that work better? You see,
Seems good. Go ahead.
okay, right, here we go. We seem to have action. So a lot of this is drawing on the recent book that I've published with a colleague. So I have to acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Karen Gravett, who has worked on some of these issues with me. And it also moves forward from the book as well. So I shall be highlighting a number of other publications, and those will be in the slides, and I will be sharing the slides with the I should be sharing the slides with the organizers so that you can have those later on if you wish. So we're thinking about linearity and binary thinking. So what do I mean by linearity? A lot of the work I do is using concept mapping. So here's a concept map, if you like, a very simple one that illustrates the idea of linearity or linear thinking, where I teach, you learn, and then we assess. And when I have new university teachers with this conception of teaching, it's very difficult to persuade them that there's any need for CPD, any need for professional development, because they see this as a very simplistic way forward, and why should anything change? So linearity is a linear sequence of ideas with no side branching and no deviation. Binary thinking, on the other hand, is really quite common, especially in the educational research literature. And many of you might be familiar with things like deep and surface learning as a binary, or teacher-centered and student-centered as a binary, or even quantitative versus qualitative research. And I would suggest that all of these binaries are actually continua and mixtures, and they're much more messy than this binary thinking would have you believe. So what I want to move to is from linear towards rhizomatic thinking, and from binary thinking towards using complexity. And this transition, these changes are not linear transitions in themselves, and neither are they binaries. So, you know, the idea of linear or rhizomatic is not a binary thinking. There is a whole continuum of thought between the two. So linear thinking is sometimes called arborescent or tree thinking, whereas non-linear thinking is often called rhizomatic thinking. And this pulls on the work of French philosopher Gilles Deleuze. If you've not read his work, I would recommend that some of the work. It is quite difficult reading. As a French philosopher, his style of writing is very different to my own, but he has got some really interesting ideas about the structure of knowledge and about rhizomatics, which I would recommend you to have a look at. So arborescent or tree thinking tends to be reductive, reduce things to the smallest possible elements for simplicity, whereas rhizomatic thinking tends to be looking at complexity and accepting that things are complex. Management systems in universities and schools tend towards the linear because they like measurement, they like simplicity, and they like accountability. And that aligns with the arborescent side of the thinking. Whereas reality tends to be much more messy. It tends to be more unpredictable and not easily measurable. The management don't like that. So here's a couple of examples of linear thinking from recent history. So in the UK, we went through the process we now know as Brexit. We left the EU. And again, if you look at the political slogans and the arguments that were put forward, It was basically Brexit was good because we take back control. And that was the argument that was presented to the population. And in a similar vein in the US, when Trump was standing for election, Trump was going to be good because he was going to make America great again. And that was the end of the argument, if you like. You can't argue with that. You know, why wouldn't you want to take back control? Why wouldn't you want to make America great again? So they are linear, simplistic arguments. So that creates problems. So they're good for winning votes. They're good for manipulating the population, but they're poor at promoting thinking. They're poor at educating the population. So in the UK, we ended up with very simplistic arguments about Brexit, summed up by phrases like Brexit means Brexit. Or as this guy in the photograph is saying, you know, leave means leave. And that was the level of argument that we were having to deal with. And if that is the be all and end all of your argument, it's very difficult to argue against leave means leave. So there are problems with linear thinking. It reduces it to very simple or simplistic viewpoints without room for nuance and argument and development. So within the education sphere, linear thinking and simplistic thinking doesn't really help us very much. And it doesn't really help us promote values for teaching. And I would suggest 4 values and principles to underpin teaching, which don't align very nicely with linear thinking, but they do align with complexity. So the idea, for example, that in education, we appreciate students' prior knowledges, and I've put knowledges plural rather than knowledge, and that we'll talk about that later on as well. And that aligns with Orzabel's idea about ascertain what students know and teach them accordingly. You know, you start from what you already know. So it's very, very important that we activate students' prior knowledge. It's not just a case of knowing that students have prior knowledge, but that needs to be activated in the process of learning so they can connect prior knowledge to new and developing knowledge. The consideration of meaningful learning or rote learning and the difference between the two. And that requires to be some constructive alignment within the curriculum. And again, there is a simplistic argument, it seems, in the educational research literature. Meaningful learning equals good, rote learning equals bad. And in general, that might be fair enough, but there are spaces where rote learning might be appropriate. You want somebody to memorize something so they can use that to move on to meaningful learning. And then arguments about formative assessment, and they seem to rage on all the time. And whilst a lot of academics and teachers will accept the arguments for formative assessment, they're not always very good at promoting it in their practice. And I would suggest that formative assessment is really, really important. It helps students to direct the flow of their learning by engaging more in the discipline and in their own subject matter learning. And it also increases their ability to relate to new knowledge. So this idea of student recipients, to receive new knowledge, and your prior knowledge structures have to be primed, ready to receive new knowledge. Otherwise, if you like, they bounce off and students just don't learn stuff. And then that encourages us to reflect on student-centered versus teacher-centered practice. And that links to all of the above. And is that a sensible binary as well? Or are student-centered and teacher-centered ideas actually a little bit old hat now? Should we be discipline-centered? Should we be subject-centered? And that's a controversy we could argue about for probably the rest of the day. So these are some basic principles which I think don't align with linear thinking and don't really align with binary thinking, but they do align more with complexity, with rhizomatics, and with non-binary thinking, if you like. So I'm going to go back to Brexit. And a lot of my research is using concept maps, as in this one, to look at the details of knowledge, the structure of knowledge. So this was my concept map of Brexit that I made shortly after the referendum back in 2016. So you can see that there's quite a lot going on here. The result of a referendum, it's about the membership of the EU. I was interested particularly in how it affected UK universities. So that forms the structure of my map. And you can see there's quite a lot of stuff there. It's not just taking back control. As time went on, I made more maps of the same thing, and those maps changed. There were different ideas coming in here. So, for example, you can see at the bottom left of this concept map, I talk about, you know, the issues of the Irish border. And now in 2022, we still haven't resolved this. So Brexit isn't finished, it's not complete, because we still have arguments about the Irish border. And yet, you know, Brexit means Brexit, whatever that was all about. So if we look at these as slices through time, slices through my understanding as it developed, my understanding of Brexit, we can then say, okay, so if I map that today, or if I do an essay about Brexit today, it will probably be different to the maps I've done previously. It will build on them. It will deviate from them. Even the act of mapping, or the act of discussing something, or the act of writing an essay changes a student's understanding. So having done your assessment, the act of doing that assessment changes your understanding. And therefore, moving forward, I understand things in a slightly different way. If we look at these concept maps, if I highlight there on the left, the concept of Prime Minister, one of the issues here as well is that just because a concept is mapped or recorded in an essay, or however you're assessing students, it doesn't mean that that concept is fixed. So my concept of Prime Minister, when I drew that map in 2016, was different to my concept of Prime Minister today. And for those of you who've been following British politics, you will know that our concept of Prime Minister seems to change on a regular basis at the moment. And you can see those names there at the top, the names that are now becoming familiar to us all. And we could think of a different adjective to go with each of those prime ministers, probably not very flattering adjectives most of the time. So the concept of Prime Minister has evolved since David Cameron came up with the idea of having a referendum on Brexit. So ideas move, ideas change, they shift with time, they shift with new understanding. And we have to accept that producing a concept map or developing any other form of assessment, the result is always provisional, because I'm becoming something else. As a result of producing these concept maps, my understanding has gone somewhere else. So my understanding has gone through, or is still going through, a process of becoming something else. A lot of the problems we face at the moment, whether we're talking about education or something else, are described as wicked problems. These problems that are in themselves difficult to define and difficult to nail down. So things like climate change, water security, the loss of biodiversity, these are the big scale wicked problems that as a society we face at the moment. But I would also say that teaching is a wicked problem. It is not something you can just go in and fix. There is no recipe, there is no algorithm for good teaching. But what I would say is that, like all wicked problems, our teaching needs to address complexity. We can't think of our teaching or our curriculum or our classrooms as simple structures where you have an input and an output and there's a magic box in the middle. So we have to address complexity. We need to go beyond binary thinking, you know, the quantitative versus the qualitative. We need to include non-scientific knowledges. And this is sometimes people get the hairs on the back of their neck starting to curl when I say this. But the cultural knowledge that people have, sometimes described as indigenous knowledges, we can't just forget these. We can't overwrite them. And we talk a lot in the UK at the moment about decolonizing the curriculum. It is very white, Western, and male-centric, or it has been over the past 50, 100, 200 years. And there are moves, therefore, to change the knowledges that we acknowledge within our education systems. And in doing that, we need to think, okay, so what are we going to assess? If we're looking at complexity, non-binary thinking, an ecology of knowledges here, what are we assessing? Are we assessing what we've already done, or are we assessing in order to go forward? So we can assess the known, the agreed curriculum knowledge, if you like. So do I remember the chemical equation for photosynthesis. That's a known and agreed bit of knowledge. But we also have the yet to be known stuff. We don't know the answers to lots of things. We don't know the answer to the biodiversity crisis. We don't know the answer to war in the Ukraine. You know, what will that answer be? And also, when we're assessing students, assessing their understanding, are we assessing them individually or are we assessing them collaboratively in groups? Again, that changes the playing field very considerably. So we can test and compare agreed knowledge, and we can assess knowledge. That's on the known agreed side. But we can also build consensus or facilitate dialogue on the yet to be known side. And that requires personal reflection, developing understanding on an individual level. So where does this fit in with the idea of tree-like knowledge and rhizomatic knowledge? Well, the known and agreed knowledge tends to be fixed in a tree-like structure. We talk about very often the tree of knowledge, and we like it to be stable. We sort of hanker after stable structures that we can call upon over and over again. And that makes us more confident if things are stable. If things are linear and hierarchical, they tend to be stable as well. But what if we talk about rhizomatic learning? How does that change things? Well, here I've got a couple of quotes for you. And one talks about the map. So that's the map of knowledge, the structure of knowledge is open and connectable in all its dimensions. It's not fixed in its dimension. It's not a tree structure. It can be tapped, reversible, susceptible to constant modification. So our understanding of knowledge is changing all the time. It can be reworked, and that can be by individuals working on their own or groups working, it says here, in social formations, in classrooms, for example. And Taylor and Harris Evans talk about learning as being entangled, non-linear, and a recursive process. And it talks about academics or other learners, it could be students, traveling in irregular ways. If you think about how we map out the curriculum, how we map out our lecture sequences or our teaching sequences, they're always very rigid and very well organized, and that looks really nice and neat and organized, but that's not the way people learn. People don't learn in a nice, smooth, linear pattern. They move in fits and starts and jumps, and they get bits of information from all sorts of places. And of course, we can't really separate our university or school knowledge and learning from our family, our work, our social life, our cultures, our religions, and all those sorts of things, which also interact with and affect the way in which we learn, the way in which we structure our understanding, and therefore, when we are assessed, the way we volunteer information for assessments, however those assessments are going to be organized. So if we look forward then, what problems do we make? Well, if we think about scoring, we generally like to score, whether we're talking about students at primary school, secondary school, university, we like to give them a score, we like to give them a mark. But this often seems to reflect in the research literature, the needs of the researchers rather than the needs of the learners. So when we read research papers, when we read reports of innovations in classrooms, the changes in scores and the improvements in learning seem to be to allow the researcher to say, look, we did a good job, rather than helping the student to actually progress in their own learning. It also tends to make students, in terms of concept maps, produce bigger maps or longer essays, if you like, whereas smaller assessments, whether it's concept maps, essays, or whatever, tend to focus the student's mind on how concepts are linked together. I've got all these ideas, but how are they linked? Because unless I can link those concepts, their meaning is arguable. And scoring, I would argue as well, tends to encourage a backward gaze. What have I achieved in the past tense? What have I fixed into my memory already? So that reinforces the philosophy of being rather than the philosophy of becoming something else. And we're often talking about lifelong learning. So we want our students to continue learning long after they've left our classroom. Okay, that's not the end of the learning process. Feedback is something which is vitally important in all types of assessment, in all types of learning. Dialogue is needed to help students create and curate knowledge, to develop knowledge, to organize knowledge, rather than to fix it. And the student's first map or student's first essay or assignment is probably not going to be their best. They need practice. They need to rehearse. What does it mean to draw a concept map? What does it mean to write an essay? Okay, whether or not you know the content and you know the discipline, the very act of being assessed in a certain style requires some expertise in understanding what that style is asking from you. And then the other thing is types of knowledge, and this is often overlooked in the research literature about what type of knowledge is it that you are assessing here? What type of knowledge do you want your students to develop? Is it practical knowledge? Is it, you know, how to change a wheel on a bicycle, for example, that sort of practical knowledge? Or is it theoretical, abstract knowledge? Because these different knowledges tend to have different structures. They tend to behave in different ways, and therefore we tend to learn them in different ways. So we need to acknowledge an ecology of knowledges. And I've got a little diagram, little photograph there, or a drawing of Lewis and Clark when they went across the USA and mapped the USA, mapped the passage from one side to the other. And they were recognized, if you like, as the scientists, as the geographers who mapped that knowledge. But that would never have happened if it wasn't for the indigenous cultural knowledge of their guide, who understood things that they didn't understand. So it's not just one sort of knowledge here. There's a whole load of knowledges that we need to acknowledge within our teaching and with our assessment. And I would go back to saying again, can we create and curate knowledge, or can we only transmit it? Because if we're only transmitting knowledge in our teaching, that limits the way we can assess it. Whereas if we are encouraging creation and curation of knowledge, then we have a whole new way of assessing things that can open up before us. So where do I want to take this then? Well, where I've been taking this is through recent research looking at the ecological university. And my work tends to be looking at universities and higher education, but the argument works just as well if you're talking about school systems as well. And so the 19th century factory model of education tends to talk about growth, efficiency, and production. We look at products. We look at our students as products going through the school factory or the university factory, coming out the other end altered in order to do something for society. And what I would argue is that the 21st century, we could look instead at an ecosystemic model of the university or our school systems. And this is quite an emancipatory, a freeing narrative to free us from this bond, if you like, of the factory model, of the industrial metaphors that we use within our education at the moment. So rather than the language of growth, efficiency, and production in education, the ecosystem model tends to use language such as caring, resilient, and sustainable, which have a completely different focus when you're talking about classroom practice or looking after our students. So the root metaphors are very, very important here. So if our root metaphors are based in industry, based in efficiency of education and developing products and so forth, we tend to have one view of learning. If we're talking more about the ecological view of learning as caring, resilient, and sustainable, that's a different ball game altogether. But what we've got to be careful of is the way we use language and how that relates to the root metaphor. So for example, in higher education at the moment, there's a lot of discussion about resilience, the resilience of staff and the resilience of students. Now, resilience can mean a whole lot of different things, depending on what sort of resilience you're talking about and what it relates to. And this goes back to my earlier comment about concepts need to relate to other concepts in order to have meaning. So if we're talking about engineering resilience, that's all about stability, maintaining the status quo. People talk about grit when they talk about that sort of resilience. And our university management systems tend to promote stability. University managers don't like things that are going to rock the boat. And so engineering resilience is built in to the idea of the neoliberal university. Whereas in the ecological university, we can look at ecological resilience, the ability to adapt when things change, moving from one basin of attraction to a different basin of attraction, depending on what's going on. And if you think about the last 2 or 3 years, our environment, our teaching environment changed overnight for many of us when COVID struck. So rather than going into our classrooms and doing all sorts of things with our students, we were stuck online, stuck on Zoom as we are today. Our environment changed completely. We couldn't do the same things. We had to adapt. So we need to be able to adapt for the next COVID that's going to come along, the next problem that's going to happen. At the moment, we're talking about, the possibility of power cuts in the winter, thanks to the war in Ukraine. That may or may not happen, but what if it does? How will that change our teaching? All sorts of things could happen in the next year, 5 years, that will change our teaching environment, change what we need to do. So we need to be very careful about the language we use and the metaphors that they are aligned to if we are going to innovate. We can innovate with engineering resilience, but it's going to be very different and very much more slow than if we are talking about ecological resilience. The idea of the ecological university, I'm going to show you some simple models in a minute, but there's quite a lot of work underpinning this, and there's a couple of references here to further work with lots of references within those articles as well to the idea of the ecological university building on ecological science rather than on industrial metaphors, if you like. And as I say, I will make these slides available so that these references will be easily accessible to you. So here's the model, the simplified model of the ecological university. And it's very simple. I can fit it on one slide and that's it, job done. So it centers on the concept of the ecosystem, of educational ecosystems. And this goes back to my earlier discussion about complexity. Ecosystems are complicated things. They are not simplistic things. And ecosystems are maintained by dynamic processes. I won't go into details about adaptive cycles and panicies at the moment, but they are dynamic moving processes. They are not static. Things are not fixed for any long period of time. And an ecosystem is constructed from our understanding of an institutional natural history. And again, this builds on the ecological literature, which says, ecology is built on an understanding of natural history. In exactly the same way, our understanding of an educational ecosystem, whether it's a school or a university or whatever, has to be built on our understanding of the natural history of that environment. What goes on there? What are the players involved? What are the interactions involved between those players? And that's the natural history part. And that's the way to build sustainable pedagogies. And that goes back then on the right-hand side of the model to talking about parallel epistemologies. Sorry about the jargon, but this goes back to talking about different knowledges, not just Western scientific knowledge, but also cultural knowledge, indigenous knowledge, personal knowledge, contextual knowledge, all those sorts of things, which may not be scientifically accurate or scientifically correct. But nonetheless, it's the way people work. People are not necessarily scientific automatons. We don't do things just because the evidence says we should, which is why people don't stop smoking or they don't stop eating donuts. Okay, people like eating donuts, even though, in the Western world, we have an obesity crisis. And it's dead simple to stop the obesity crisis, just don't eat so much. That's the scientific answer. But the scientific answer is not sufficient because people don't behave in rational, predictable ways. So that's my model of the ecological university. And we'll come back to elements of that in just a moment. But what about the ecologically sick university then? Because in my mind, I like to balance things up, If it can be healthy, it can also be sick. So what happens in the ecologically sick university or school system? Well, one thing that happens is that teachers continue with practices that they know don't work. Teachers do things that they know are bad practice. They do this all the time. So, for example, I go around observing teaching in the university for a living, and I see a lot of content-heavy lectures dominated by PowerPoint, where students are sitting passively, even though there's a vast literature out there about active learning. But as scientists, we ignore that evidence because it's inconvenient. We don't want the students to learn actively because we have to work more in our teaching. So a passive PowerPoint is much easier in some ways. We teach students to be consumers and not producers. As an example of teachers doing things they know don't work, I had a conversation with a member of staff a couple of years ago before I went to observe his lecture. And I said, okay, what are you going to do? And he said to me, I have to cover all of cell biology in 90 minutes. That's the job I've been given to do. So I say, well, is that possible? And he says, no, it's not possible. Of course, it's not possible. No way it can be done. So I say, okay, so what are you going to do? And his answer was, I'm just going to talk very quickly. So he knows that that will not work. He knows that he's going to gabble his way through loads and loads of content to get the job done, the job being getting through the content. But if the job is supporting students learning, he knows he will fail. But he feels like he can't escape from this trap that's been given to him by the university, so he will perform what he's been asked to perform and do something that he knows will not work. We end up in the ecologically sick university with a narrative monoculture that stifles innovation. The same things are said all the time. There's only one way of doing things. And this has been described as the neoliberal university, where consumerism, if you like, and financial targets and accountability are seen as the drivers of how we proceed. And this, I predict, will end up in an equivalent of a silent spring. And I'm drawing here upon Rachel Carson's famous book from 1962, where she predicted that, you know, our agricultural monocultures, use of pesticides, will end up with a silent spring. You know, that we won't hear the noise anymore. The birds will die off. In exactly the same way, I think we will end up with a silent spring where teachers, young lecturers won't have the courage to innovate. They won't have the courage to say something different because they'll be shot down because it's not cost effective, it's not efficient. And so what we end up is with a loss of diversity of ideas. And that's dangerous because diversity is our savior in times of crisis. When COVID hit, there was lots of different ways of getting around the problems that we were faced with. If there was just one way of doing it, we would have been in problem. If you don't think we're in trouble in education, and I'm talking particularly about higher education because that's my field of research, but I think school education has similar problems as well. So if you still don't think we're in trouble in higher education, look at the literature that's out there at the moment. Look at the book titles. It is really scary. You know, the war on higher education, the toxic university, where he's talking about zombie leadership, or how universities die. Now, of course, these can be, I can't see, all I can see is a white screen. If I'm running out of time.
Yeah, sorry, interchange. You're 5 minutes to go.
Okay, 5 minutes to go. So there are lots of books there basically telling us that we are in trouble. Universities are in ruins. We've got to move forward. We've got to develop. I myself wrote an article a few years ago called Universities as Centres of Non-Learning. I expected a backlash from that. And indeed, there wasn't one. Everyone sort of said, yeah, fair enough, that there are going to be problems. There's nothing we can do about it because the neoliberal university says we can't do anything about it. I'm going to zip forward just a little bit because I'm told that time is short, and that's fair enough. And I'm taken far too long to start things up. So talking about assessments, whether it's concept maps, whether it's essays, multiple choice, or anything else, what are we assessing for? Are we assessing prior learning? Are we assessing what people have already achieved, what's already fixed? Or are we assessing for future learning, what they will need to do, what they will need to know after they've finished formal education? And the latter requires us to think about what's going on at the edge of our understanding. So if we think about the adjacent possible, what's at the edge of what we know now? If we unravel certain new concepts, so X here being a new concept and Y being the target concept, the thing we want students to learn, how do we go about that? And what are the implications? Because once you know why, you opened up a new adjacent. There's a new vista there, new possibilities for learning. And as Garvey Berger said, it's the space at the edge of people's understanding where we can find the most fertile ground for transformation. So it's not the stuff that's fixed, it's the stuff that's still being formed. That's where students' learning can be transformed. That's where the exciting things are going to happen. So I'm going to draw to a close so that we've got time for a few questions at the end. And I'm going to offer a question. I mean, it's not the question you have to answer, but it's a question. Should assessment focus on documenting prior learning, so us being trees, or should it support future learning and allow us to become rhizomes? And I think the the ecological university or the ecological school system is a way of allowing us to become rhizomes. And that way we are more likely to engage with innovation in education than if we are a forest of trees. I will pause there and I will stop the sharing.
And hopefully you can hear me. Well, wow, Ian, that was mind-blowing, if you don't mind me saying so. You've covered an awful lot of interesting area. I honestly did not expect to hear Brexit mentioned in the next 3 days. In fact, I was kind of hoping it wouldn't get mentioned, but you did mention it, and it does raise the issue, I think, and you also mentioned President Trump. It raises the fact that we live in a highly politicized world in which there seems to be a binary of everything. There's always two sides. There's never any sort of intermediary grey area in that. And I wonder if you had some view as to the impact that has on what we plan and try to do within education, this sort of polarization of opinion out there in the world.
But I think the polarization doesn't happen, and when we end up with this reductive yes or no type argument, you know, to Brexit, if you like, yes or no, good, bad, and it's all good or it's all bad. There were no nuances to it at all. And I think it can be the same with educational innovation. You know, should we do this or should we do that? Is it all good or all bad? Is PowerPoint, for example, all bad? Because if you read the research literature on PowerPoint, it's all bad. And of course, we've all been to lectures where the PowerPoint was terrible. The lecture droned on and on and on, didn't look at the students. And so we say, yes, PowerPoint's bad. And of course, I've also seen brilliant PowerPoints. I've also seen people use it really innovatively, use it as a background to their discussion. So I think the reductionist view, the binary view of the world, which I think is also promoted by various management stances, is highly problematic. And of course, for management, they want a simple choice. Do I do this or do I do this? Yes or no? Because we either invest money or we don't invest money. And I think that then rather sort of washes over things that could be interesting. And I think we need to think about things a little bit more in more nuanced ways. You know, lectures, for example, are lectures bad or are lectures good? And again, if you look at the research literature, a lot of it says, oh yeah, lectures are really bad because students are passive. Well, I've seen lectures where students are really active. And of course, students don't have to be running around and shouting to be active. If their brains are active, then job done. And I think, you know, it's a way of thinking, what do we think about, what do we mean by active learning. It's not necessarily standing up and running around and making noise. Active learning can be sitting quietly and thinking actively. So yeah, I think that the binary is a problem, in short.
Lovely. Time is slightly, well, time is definitely against us, and my apologies that we got off to a slow start and so on. I'm just going to take that last one because a question that's come through from one of our delegates. I think it's very, just spotted it because I think it's very important. How to train the current generation of trainers? I assume we mean teachers and trainers and lecturers and so on these concepts. If you had a magic wand, give us 2 or 3 little bullet points you think that we could insert into the training to make people aware and pick up some of these points.
There is no magic bullet, unfortunately. And
I'm afraid you're going to say that.
I spend my time running around the university talking to people, trying to get them excited about different things to do with teaching. I think one thing is to realize that teaching is not fixed. And whilst I had a discussion with somebody yesterday online, whilst novice teachers think, yeah, it's all fixed, I can't do anything, it's not in my control. Actually, there's still a lot in your control within a classroom. Within the university, I do encourage people as much as possible, go and watch people teach in different disciplines. So if you teach engineering, go and watch the actors training. Go and watch how they teach, and it will be completely different and it will blow your mind. And it's no good saying, oh, it's completely different in engineering, we can't possibly do that. Or politics and physics, and the physicists say, yeah, but it's completely different in physics. No, it's not. It's exactly the same. It's you that make it different. You can make it a different however you want. And the only difference between teaching medicine and teaching English literature is the context. Otherwise, it's still, you know, working with people's minds, getting them to think, getting them to solve problems rather than just memorizing chunks of information for an exam. Well, one of the most controversial arguments we have is, should we get rid of exams? And that divides the campus completely in two. And there's those that say, let's get rid of all the exams, and then we'd have time to think and time to teach. And the other half of the campus will say, oh, if we get rid of the exams, the students won't do any work because they work for the exam. And of course, in the current climate, we encourage them to work for the exam. And that's the question they will ask, isn't it? At the beginning of the semester, yeah. Is this going to be on the exam? Because if it's not, I won't bother to learn it. And you think, well, if there was no exam, that would really blow their minds, wouldn't it? And they would have to engage with the discipline rather than worrying about, is it going to be on the exam?
There's a one last point which has come through from Jamal here, which is, I think he's asking about the non-developed or the undeveloped countries where Barry passed the chalk and ball. Do you think there's a differential here as to where physically the landscape in which you're teaching is different because you know, just facilities may not be there and so on?
Facilities can change things, but you know, I've seen really poor teaching in state-of-the-art lecture theatres with all of the gizmos and toys that you could imagine, but I've seen really poor teaching there. I've seen fantastic teaching standing out in the field. You know, so I don't think...
So have I, in schools under trees in India. Some absolutely fantastic engagements, yeah.
So I don't think, you know, the resources are necessarily a problem. Having said that, you know, I have, you know, colleagues who are now teaching at Surrey, for example, who were teaching in Africa, and they said, you know, when they were teaching in Africa, they had a room with 200 students in, and they had to teach them. And of course, if you've got 200 students, it does rather limit what you can do. But then, you know, at Surrey, we have some classes with 500 students in them, with all the facilities you'd want. I'm not sure necessarily we do any better with all our digital toys than people who only got a chalkboard. You know, the key tool, I think, in a classroom are people's minds. And I think if they are open you can do anything you want to.
And I think that is a very important point. And if everyone will forgive me, that's a good point at which I shall draw a conclusion to this first one. There's been loads of feedback on the chat, some more questions, very positive response, I'm sure. And big thank you for a lovely, really good, interesting 30 minutes or so, if not longer, actually, looking at the clock.
And if anybody wants to email me with a specific question or engage in a dialogue about anything I've said, then I'm more than happy to chat with people outside of this forum.
And we encourage that as well. We'll include your email, if I may, when we distribute the slides. And can I say therefore, thank you ever so much, Ian, for fascinating session.
Thank you, Ian from Brian. Thank you.
All the best.
Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found something useful.
It was fascinating. I'm just now. Okay, sorry about that. Right, now, without further ado, we'll move straight on to our next session, which is one of our special sessions, breaking from conventional assessment with portable custom interactions from Patrick Plichart. And my apologies, merci, who's co-founder, solutions architect for open assessment technologies, and Jean-Philippe Rivière, who's web developer and founder of Wiquid. And I hope I've pronounced Wiquid correctly as well. Great stuff. Okay, I shall leave you in their capable hands. I shall be back again in about 20 minutes or so to kick off the next session. So without further ado, over to you, Patrick, over to you, Jean-Philippe.
All right, thank you very much, Jeff. Let me just start my slides here. All right, so, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, who knows, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today. So I'm Patrick Plichart. I'm co-founder and solution architect at Open Assessment Technologies. And today I'm joined by Jean-Philippe Rivière, founder of Wiquid. And we are really excited to introduce you to the concept of portable custom interactions, a slightly more technical topic, but we have prepared some demonstration for you to make sure we convey the right messages here. So I wanted to start this presentation with some pictures here. Basically, so OAT is helping a lot of countries in their digital transformation of their assessment. So, and what we have been witnessing quite often is obviously there is a tradition of using paper for national exams or diagnostic assessments. The trend is obviously, and it's natural, right, is to start by thinking that going digital is basically taking all the paper exams and flipping it upside down, sticking it on the screen, and there you go, you have your digital assessment, right? And it's okay, right? It's a start. But obviously it's a bit narrow, right? You still limit yourself with what was possible on the paper for assessment. And obviously nowadays with computers, with web-based application, you can really go beyond what is possible on the paper, and you can leverage more interesting data than just a final response, a final choice to a question. You can really look at how the candidate, the student, the kid behave during the assessment, and focus a little bit more on detecting the exact weaknesses and where you can improve, right? It's a learning journey. So it's a bit more opportunistic, right? This presentation, we are looking at what the technology is capable of, and we are offering that to the assessment world. But you will all agree, especially from the learning ecosystem in the learning ecosystem software. There are plenty of applications there already available that are very rich, where learners can discover artifacts, can see how those artifacts behave, can really learn right through those web-based applications. So they are very rich, very interactive, with a strong focus on learning, discovering, trying, etc. And while in the assessment area, we are still a bit limited indeed to simple choice question at the end of the day. And here, obviously, the opportunity is to start leveraging all those learning web-based applications. And you might think, okay, but it seems quite difficult also from a technological standpoint, right, to start taking all of those cool web-based applications and embed that into an assessment platform. I mean, it means integration, it means effort. What does it mean exactly? Right? And it might seem expensive, right, to start leveraging all those applications into an assessment platform to deliver this to students in the context of assessment this time. Why not just in the context of strict educational content, right? Well, actually, it's not that difficult. It's not expensive. And this is where this concept of portable custom interactions kicks in. So today, you have a lot of those educational web apps that are open source, right? So that means they're free to be used, even to be modified very often, etc. Like here, so here I have some in the illustrations. I have GeoGebra in top left, maybe you know it. There's Blockly, it's a programming tool where kids can learn to program, so they can run their little program, etc. You have also a lot of science-based web applications, implementing physics, etc. Sometimes gamification of math. So there are plenty of those web-based apps, and a lot of them are also open source, so free. There are also open source assessment platform already out there in the market, and Tao is one, right? It's actually the leading one. And in order to be able to embed all those interactive web-based application into an assessment platform, you can use standards, and you can use this concept of portable custom interaction. Now, I will describe a little bit how it works exactly all together. But that's the idea, basically, is that you can go beyond traditional interaction, beyond multiple choice, right? And use any kind of rich interactions within your assessment using PCI. So how does it work? Just from a high-level standpoint. Basically, a PCI, so this is standard from One EdTech, right, formerly known as IMS, right? So it's part of QTI standard, so it's a standard that describes assessment content. So which basically means also that any content, any assessment, any test described in QTI is interoperable. So that means it can be exported in and out between systems of assessments, right? And PCI is part of that, right? So that means that any assessment that will contain a PCI will also be interoperable, can be moved from one system, assessment system, to the other, right? So how it works is basically a technical interface that basically states that, okay, whatever the interaction, whatever the content there, the rich content, right? Whatever, a PCI needs to submit at some point data, like process data, right? But it's some sort of black box, this process data, right, for analysis, and a final score, right? But within the PCI, it can be anything. It can be a video game. It can be anything that is doable nowadays with computers, right? So what we do usually to be able to leverage that opportunity is that we can wrap any web-based application, preferably open source, as a PCI to make sure that this web-based application, Rich, can submit this kind of data to our system using this PCI interface. And once we have just wrapped this web-based application, then you can embed it into assessments, and it can be run in any QTI, PCI compliant test runner like ours that is called Tau Advanced. And there you go, you can administer assessments, including rich interactions, generating data that is not limited to a final response, including process data, behavior, right? So particularly interesting to for analysis to determine also the learning behavior, etc. Right? And yeah, so that is PCI, right, in a nutshell. And we thought that we will demonstrate a little bit this concept with just a few examples running in the Tau platform. And for this, I will basically give the token now to Jean-Philippe Rivière, who will make the demonstration. So please, Jean-Philippe.
Hello, I'm Jean-Philippe Rivière. I'm based in Toulouse, France. And today I'm going to show you a little bit of my work. And Patrick, I will take... Can you? Yes, thank you. Let's share. You should see now my Tau platform for the demo. But first of all, I wanted to say something about the PCI. PCI, it's true that I am a PCI developer. I developed a lot of PCI for the French Ministry of Education. And it could be simple to do, it could be complex. I'm going to show you today the GeoGebra PCI. That was not a simple work because at the origin, GeoGebra was not designed to be a PCI. So I had to create with the GeoGebra team as a GeoGebra developer. I had to modify a little bit their code to adapt and to find solutions that were not so obvious. So technically, this work was important. And it is true, as I said, as Patrick said, that a PCI could be very, very simple. In this case, we are talking about implemented a whole application, and that is quite complex. So, but just to be clear, this product is completely free. It's under GeoGebra license, so you can download it, put it in Tau, and use it as you want. What is the idea of a GeoGebra PCI? When you have to organize an assessment, you can use simply this PCI as a complementary tool. I show you, for example, here. I can describe an activity and ask to do some task to the student. And below there is the full GeoGebra application that is available with all the menu, all the capacity you can have with GeoGebra. And it is a neutral environment for GeoGebra. And the student just have to use it. And we can collect, as Patrick said, we can collect some all information we want from this activity. And also track all the action that was done by the student. The idea is also to have the possibility to use the fantastic GeoGebra library. And here I just have a little problem here. Sorry. If you are going to geogebra.org, you can browse the library, and the library is completely huge. It has many items already done. It is not sometimes it's really items, sometimes it's a part of a lessons, an illustration, a way to show how to do something. So it is really rich, and it is very easy to import this element in the Tao platform and in the PCI. I show you, but I just have to. Can you see my screen? Yes, I think so. Patrick, yes, I have to show you this. This is the most important. In the URL, you have a code, and the code corresponds to the activity. Here, for example, we can let's have a look here. For example, at this application here, and we have this code. We can grab this code and go to the Tao platform. Here we are, and in the Tao platform, we can just paste the element here, and you see there is a preview, and we can open the project and immediately use it to build some questions, and that is very efficient, and it means that you can inject more than 1 million of items in the Tao platform. That is very, very rich, very efficient. So I was talking about this first step. We don't say for the moment. The first step was to use GeoGebra as a complementary tool in an assessment, as a neutral tool, let's say. But it could be also a part. It could be also a part of the instruction. I mean that you could present to the students. In some ways, I've chosen here a spreadsheet and a chart, but there is many configuration. If you, I don't know what is your level of knowledge in GeoGebra, but you have many configuration. I can take some seconds to show you how it works. And so it is a part of the presentation. It means that you are building your question, your item, showing this information and using to create the question. Another way to see the GeoGebra part in an item could be, for example, to show, for example, this item looks like it's quite complex. It is showing many action, many parameters, and it could be a part, not of the question, let's say, but a part of the answer. I mean that the student will have to manipulate, to explore, to click, to interact with the item to find the solution and to answer, of course. Next. So you understand that GeoGebra can be it's so complex and so rich that it is a kind of subsystem of generating items, like a special framework to generate item in Tao. Here, for example, I show a way to create this kind of representation, graphical representation, and I'm showing a process and illustrating how I followed the process. And the real instruction here are showing that there is another process to redo with GeoGebra. You just have you must have in mind that GeoGebra is very used in French college, in French schools for 11 years old, starting from 11 years old. So the learning curve of GeoGebra is now, let's say that they are already the knowledge to use GeoGebra, and so it is really relevant to propose and to check how they can master this tool in this kind of context. Voilà. And you just noticed also one thing. It is that a PCI must be an element that is own logic, and it's an autonomous module. Autonomous modules means that you can have many instances in the same item. So it could be quite a complex item, and you can add many GeoGebra in the same place.
5 minutes to go.
5 minutes, yes. You could have also GeoGebra as a complex stimulus analysis. You see that you can propose element to interact to, and say, let's say, can you do how can you realize an item like that? And you could ask, you can mix that with common interaction, of course, and ask the student to write a scenery to do this kind of work. And here, it's very important to have in mind that it's so powerful and it is so open that GeoGebra, of course, can be used not only for math, but for a different kind of activity and for different kind of thematics. It's really interesting to learn how you can use it and to see if in the GeoGebra library there is not an item that could help you to assess, to help you to teach the content. Another thing is it is very impressive to see that how GeoGebra can propose a really different solution. For example, here you have a whole environment to make a design. Here you can use a ruler here and create some lines, of course, with the pen. And I have no time to do a demo like this, but it is quite rich. You have many possibilities. You can combine that with classic mathematical tools, with different forms and figures. And you can also integrate really complex element. For example, you can use it as a mind mapper, and you can put images, sound, and many things. So it is really a creative tool, open creative tool that not only mathematicians can use. And yes, it's quite interesting in this. What else? There are so many things to show. Let's say that yes. So if you understand well, a PCI is a kind of an element in a Lego, and a question could be composed with many PCIs. So if you just check, for example, here I have few PCIs that I have already done, and all PCIs can be combined with or common interaction or different PCI. Yeah. Just to finish the presentation, I have maybe 1 minute. No, something. Yes. GeoGebra has also a very powerful tool that for me it's quite important. For example, you have the zooming capacity, and you can put it right everything in a bigger screen. So it could be very helpful for in some cases. Of course, you have internalization, so it means that all the translation are already implemented. You have the dimension of GeoGebra. If you are using, for example, tablets or different kind of screens, you can adapt all your settings here. And you have a very important element that is the construction protocol. The construction protocol is following each step realized by the student, and it's a kind of super report to analyze how the student has interacted with the application. I think that, yes, I didn't talk about the scoring system. The scoring system is could be or automatic, or you can gather some information. You will choose some information and build your item respecting some rules, or you can also take the whole representation of the application. I mean that if you ask a student to realize a graph or some formulas in GeoGebra, you can grab it at a B64 string. Yes, that's it. I think I tried to show you how GeoGebra PCI is rich, and it is quite expected in the little world of the digital assessment. Thank you.
And thank you, Jean-Philippe, and thank you, Patrick. As I said before, sending my French, merci. There's some feedback on there. We obviously got some ideas and questions come through. I'm going to assume, Patrick and Philippe, you're happy for people to email you directly with questions and queries. And I, as somebody who's been involved in maths at 16 plus and 18 plus for a number of years, that was fascinating. Amazing what we can do nowadays. Just blows the mind away, doesn't it? So thank you ever so much, guys. That was really, really interesting and very useful. And we appreciate your efforts in speaking to us today. And I wish you bon voyage. Thank you. Do stay around. Oh, excuse me. We're going to move on to our next session now, in which we have 3 speakers, and we broadly called this session assessment practice, and the flavour of it, I hope for you'll pick up through that, is how we deliver successfully assessment and computer-based testing and assessment projects in the real world. We've got 3 speakers: Alli, Privitt, Dan Farley, and Wendy Choi, from 3 different arenas entirely. And what we'll do is we'll ask each of the 3 presenters to do their 15 or so minutes presentation, and I'll take questions and answers at the end, unless there's some sort of burning clarification question that you have for any of the speakers. Then I'm happy to take those just after each speaker. So we have 3 speakers now coming up. So I'll say I'm just waiting to see Dan, who's the second of our speakers, come up on the screen. But in the meantime,
let's proceed with Alli as Dan's coming in.
Yeah. So we have 3 speakers. So first of ours is Alli Privitt. She helps elevate learning experiences here. She's an independent learning consultant, and she's hopefully going to challenge you to step out of your comfort zone and become uncomfortable with being comfortable. I think I understand that. Yeah. Relish change. And as somebody who's been a change manager in their career, it's nice to hear people ringing the bell for change. So without much further ado, I'm going to hand over to Alli, leave her in your capable hands, and please step forward digitally, Alli.
Thank you, Jeff. All right. Let's get the presentation on here. All right. So this presentation, and thank you so much, Beyond Multiple Choice, for having me, is all about ways to think beyond the score in assessment and helping teachers and students and you as a learner how to use assessments for your future learning. And without having talked to Ian, this presentation is going to fall right in line with what he was talking about this morning. So I hope to kind of add some kind of real life practicality to how you can move assessments for future learning rather than looking backwards, as he put it. So a little bit about me. I am a former high school chemistry teacher. I started my own business about a year and a half ago and have kind of transitioned out of the classroom, doing various projects in education, consulting, speaking, all of that. I also like to add, because I like to get people out of their comfort zone, myself included, I am a skydiver and a thrill seeker, adventure seeker, all of that, which just kind of makes this presentation add a little, I don't know, thrill to it, so to speak. You never know what I'm gonna kind of show you or do next, as my friends and whatnot say, because I just jump out of planes. All right, so how I wanted to start this presentation is that in my own teaching career, something that I really wanted to kind of move forward with is that students are more than a letter grade or a number on a piece of paper. And this came out of years of seeing students feel like their worth was put on that numerical value. And so it was a transition that I saw in the first couple of years of like, how do I help students and convince them that their worth is not based on what a number says or what a letter grade says. And so a question I kept coming back to over and over again is what do test scores tell us about student success, and what do they tell us about ourselves? And so before we kind of get into this, you weren't prepared for this, but I'm going to give you a pop test because you just never know what we're going to have here. You're going to get 60 seconds. Do your best. I'm just going to preface this with, if you are very math savvy, maybe wait until closer to the 60-second mark to type in your answer in the chat box. But if you think you know the answer, feel free to type it. It is a number. And we'll see what we get here. So you've got 60 seconds on the clock for this problem here. If x, y, and z are positive integers and 3x equals 4y equals 5z, what is the least possible value of x, y, and z? X plus y plus z. And I'm going to give you about 45 more seconds. Twenty more seconds. Very okay. So we do have some right answers here. Very good for those who got 47. Good job. If you want to look this up, I just wanted to do a pop test, but it's more to get you to think about how you were feeling when I announced that you were going to have a pop test. Okay. And I call this test day stress. Okay. And what I saw in my teaching career is that test day was very, very stressful for the majority of students. And like, I don't know how your heart rate felt, if you felt like, oh, now, or just like, I need to be focused, I need to be aligned, I need to be in the moment right now, I need to be thinking, I need to be like, whatever you felt, okay, elevate that and magnify it for students, especially in that. And the reason this topic came up is because I put myself through a very, very stressful experience this summer with becoming a licensed skydiver and being in a full throttle learning seat where danger was extremely, extremely high. And it kind of brought back these feelings of when I was in school. And the further you are removed from that, the further you can kind of forget that test day stress. And one thing that I did in my classroom that I noticed early on was I didn't like students feeling stressed. I wanted to celebrate student learning on test day and celebrate what they did and what they knew and what they didn't know, and have that be a discussion rather than this point where students felt like their worth was based on a score. And so what I started telling students and myself as a teacher is that scores alone aren't predictive, and we can use them, but they aren't the end all be all. They are a data point at a moment in time. And they really, data points by themselves are not reliable. Okay. It's when they're combined with lots and lots of data. And then you can see trend lines and you can see where it might go. But by themselves, you don't know where the next point is going to be. And we need to teach ourselves as well as our students, that tests and assessment scores are not for the now. And Ian did a really good job of talking about this in his presentation, with they're really backward looking and whatnot. So when I started asking these questions, I really wanted to know, well, what could I do instead? How could I relieve test day stress and that angst and that kind of just pressure to perform and everything? And maybe you felt that in that minute of the pop test, okay? Is that we really should change the narrative to tests. And I swear I didn't talk to Ian, but tests should be used as feedback for future learning. And releasing that test day stress. So here are some ideas and ways that we can do just that. So one, you can treat tests as snapshots, so they truly are, and convey this to your students. And remind yourself of this when you're in the learner's seat. And when I started communicating that to my students and being like, today is a celebration day. Today is where you get to show me, you know, what you have learned from what we're studying, and let's celebrate that and take the snapshot, because people like I still like Polaroid snapshots. You know, you only get that one instance. You can't go back and edit and refine it. And when you communicate that to your students, they buy into it, and it takes time, because they may have been through however many years of it being stressful. But when you shift the narrative and you bring that kind of joy back into assessment, and that it's a show and tell and it's a celebration and it's a snapshot, a true snapshot, you're going to get that feedback back. They're going to mirror that back to you over time. And I like to treat tests as feedback. So this is me kicking over you know, the Leaning Tower of Pisa in my travels, but also just pushing over the kind of traditional model of tests, in that they are this endpoint, and that really we want to treat tests as feedback. And so when you are giving back tests, because they want to put their value into the score, and if you even want to give a score, is that instead having students reflect on some key questions. So things I like to ask students when they're getting an assessment back of any kind is, well, what did you know? I even like to ask this on the test, you know, like, you know, what did you know that I didn't ask, or that we didn't cover, but you learned? And it's not this like yes or no, multiple choice, you knew the right answer, you knew didn't. And I taught us a subject, chemistry, which is very objective in terms of the right answers, right? There's not a lot of subjectivity to, you know, what is element 7 on the periodic table, okay? And what is a covalent bond? Stuff like that. There is less subjectivity to it. But like, what did you learn? What did you know? What do you still wonder about is such a powerful question, and it moves it to the forward thinking of learning. And then where do you want to go from here? Like, you know, leaning into what is next, always getting kids excited about the story and where is it going? And we just learned this one thing, but where can it go next? And then really trying to show the future of learning, and the bigger test of learning is the thousands of data points, and helping students to see their own trend lines in learning. Maybe they didn't understand this topic, but it opens up space for them to get better at it moving forward. And so I loved to show students that learning is everywhere. It's in the brainstorming, it's in the question asking, it's in your note taking, and the meaning making you get from this, the lab designing, the questions that you ask are so much more important than the answers that you know. And when I changed my framework to learning is everywhere, and it's not just on test day, it invited students into the learning space every day, and got them kind of excited to be part of that journey. So if it's not tests, you know, what was the point of the classroom? And in that role of learning, I really liked to frame my classroom as chemistry is the vehicle in which I'm helping you to learn. And you can input whatever you're teaching into that model. It is the vehicle in which we learn. And because chemistry is a particularly abstract topic and it's not recognizable, students don't have a lot of prior knowledge, it actually was the perfect setting to get students to, whatever they're encountering something new, to apply that for future learning, because they'd have to use those skills in my class to learn abstract material, which they could then use in any other topics that they wanted to moving forward. And what I found is that the journey is so much more important than the destination. And when you create that environment, you get kids who really just find that joy in the learning process, and it relieves a lot of that stress. So I always liked to say to my students is that treat tests as a data point, not a pinnacle point. It is not your worth. It is not the end all be all, and it is not your value, and it is not the end. It's not the peak. It's just the beginning. And that transformation was really, really powerful in teaching. And so then what you do with that data point, what you do with that test is how you move yourself forward. And I wanted to end with, I also like, you just never know what you're going to get. I like to write kind of poems and odes and everything. So I did an ode to going beyond the score and here for you to end this presentation. So do I still grade tests and put a numerical value on them? Why? Yes, I do, but only to give students feedback. I dream of a day of tests without scores or no traditional tests at all. There are so many other ways to learn and show one's learning. But if we have to test and assess to have numerical data, let's lean into tests being powerful, only to move us forward and not hold us back, to give us that data point to put against all the others, and to remember it is just one data point on one day, at one moment in time, in one subject area, in one focused topic of that subject. It's insignificant on its own. Focus on trends and data over time. That's the power of learning over time. Thank you so much, Beyond Multiple Choice. If you would like to connect with me, I'm on LinkedIn. That's my website. I'm on Instagram, and you can always email me. I don't think Jeff was ready for me to be done.
So technology was defeating me for a moment then. My apologies about that. I was just sorting out to give you a 5-minute notice. Okay, thank you ever so much, Alli. That's fine. Our second speaker in this session is Dan Farley, Administrator for Research. It's a long job title you have here, Dan. Administrator for Research, Assessment, Data, Accountability and Reporting at DOE Oregon. I'm going to, if you're ready to go, Dan, I shall hand over to you.
I'm ready to go.
Look forward to it. Right. Over to you, Dan.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. And thanks, Alli, for that introduction. Lots of learning and lots of complexity in the conversation as well. I'll make sure my screen is visible to everybody, and then I will get started. All right. So I am here to talk about another example, kind of hearkening to what Ian shared this morning, of things that we continue to keep doing even though we know better. And I'm calling the presentation the True Score Fallacy. I will try to keep the chat going as well. And I'll also try to explain acronyms that may not be accessible to everyone as I go. But as Jeff mentioned, I do have a long title. It's gotten even longer since I started. I'm now the Assistant Superintendent of all of those buckets of work at the Oregon Department of Education in the United States. So I wanted to talk about what assessment looks like when it's at its best. At its best, assessment makes learning visible and reveals ways that we can help students, as Alli was naming. It can actually be magic, as it makes the unseen seen. That was why I got originally entranced by assessment. It made cognitive processes that I couldn't see visible. However, we have used assessment results too often to close doors on opportunities. And assessment shouldn't be doors, it should be windows to see our next learning moves through, not doors that convince us or students to stop learning. So a little bit of context about the assessment system that I help oversee in Oregon. It's composed of summative assessments, which are end of year assessments that assess a student's mastery of a year's worth of content. And we also have interim assessment system, and we are supporting formative practices. But the example that I'll be sharing with you today is a summative assessment problem. And summative assessments are really designed to be accurate at the student group level. And they are not supposed to be, they're not intended to be or designed to be reliable or used at the individual student level. Nonetheless, we have situations, of course, in which those kinds of practices are pervasive. So in Oregon, we administer state summative assessments in English language arts and mathematics in all grades 3 through 8 and 11, to all students rather. We also assess science in elementary, middle, and high school 1 time each. And those assessments, actually, we have been successful in divorcing them, if you will, from high stakes decision making, including for students and in most cases for teachers or educators. The example that I'm sharing with you today is one that's kind of on the edge of that process. It's an assessment that is in place to, in the minds of the U.S. Department of Education, protect students' civil rights and ensure that students who are eligible have access to English language development services. So I'm going to start by talking about something that we tend to ignore, and this is part of the true score fallacy that I'm trying to set the stage for. And it has to do with the concept that in measurement exists. It's a fact. And how many of you, I don't know, because of possible national differences, recognize this tool. It's a very common classic Stanley measuring tape in the United States. I wanted you to think about this measuring tape because I think considering this tool can really help us make some ethereal measurement concepts much more concrete. So for example, consider the scale on this measuring tape. It's 25 feet long, and it is designed that every increment on that scale is the same. So it doesn't matter where you are on that scale. The measurement of an inch, for example, is the same. So from 23 feet 2 inches to 23 feet 3 inches is the same distance as from 2 to 3 inches on the tape, like it should be. That's what's called an equal interval scale. This actually makes it quite dissimilar from our measurement instruments, where we cannot say that an inch of ability, if you will, at one end of the scale is the same as an inch of ability on the other end of the scale. It's something to be quite aware of as we proceed. So even if we assume that this is an equal interval scale, how reliably do you think it would measure a board that is actually 32 inches long? Let's say we know that objectively. And should it yield the same measure no matter who is using the tape? What if 2 different carpenters are using 2 identical measuring tapes? Should they match in terms of their measurement? One thing to consider, which is something I didn't know until I became a laborer and then a framer in high school and college, was that what you see labeled here as the hook is actually accounted for by the tape design. So when you're measuring an abutted measure, the hook slides backwards exactly the width of the hook to make sure that the measurement is accurate. Whereas when you're pulling the hook at the end of a board, it slides back out to accommodate the width of the hook as well. So that's one kind of built-in reliability feature that many don't know about or are not aware of. There are a lot of course, psychometric principles built into scale development that the general public is not aware of as well. And that's one of the reasons I pointed that out. The real question when we are engaged in measurement, of course, is how precise do we need to be with the measure? So when I did construction with my boss, we actually calibrated our tapes. He asked me to measure a board and cut it at 18 inches. I did that. That didn't match 18 inches on his measuring tape. So he actually bent the hook on my measuring tape so that it matched his, so that we were at least self-consistent. And we were only doing framing. So most of my cuts, if I were within a 1/16 of an inch or an 1/8 of an inch, they were fine. They were, going into walls. No one was going to see them. Whereas if they were cuts that were finished carpentry, like if they were cabinets or finished trim, those cuts have to actually be perfect because everyone sees those cuts. The same thing is true in measurement. We can be more loose with precision when we don't need to be accurate at the individual student level. However, we have to be really accurate and have a lot of items if we're trying to demonstrate a reliable measure at the individual student level. So all of these things affect measurement, not just with a measuring tape, which is hopefully an accessible example, but they also show up in test design and test development. And these things are all affect validity, which is how we use the results from the assessments. That's what I'm going to talk about next. So in classical test theory, the observed score, which is the score that the assessment generates in reference to the scale, is equal to the true score, which is a postulated score, a latent trait that is unobservable, combined with measurement error, which we can estimate psychometrically. So it is true that the true score, as proposed by this image, can't be measured. We propose that it's there, and then we proceed to measure it. And then that measurement, we assume, has some type of measurement error. In other words, we never take a measure, either with a test or with a measuring tape, that's 100% precise, right? The challenge in practice is we tend to ignore error as part of this equation. And while it's true that modern test theories, such as item response theories, et cetera, are less sample dependent rather, in estimating observed scores, they do not and cannot eliminate error from the measurement process. It remains a fact that error in measurement must be accounted for in situations where test results are used for individuals, especially for high stakes decision making. And yet that continues not to be the case. So why are observed scores treated as true scores? Why do practitioners ignore confidence intervals? Why do numbers give confidence where instead they should be yielding to curiosity? In order to represent student level uses of test scores in high stakes contexts, we must either rid the system of such uses, which I have done to the degree that I can in the state of Oregon, or we have to put additional support systems in place to address the fact that error exists in measurement. And I'm going to share one example of how we are looking at that in Oregon. So kind of consistent with the theme of the conference, it would be safer to come here and present work that we have already done to make our state assessment system more accessible, inclusive, or equitable. However, I believe that sharing a work in progress is more engaging. So you're not going to see a finished, polished product here. You're going to see the middle of messy work that is, as Ian pointed out, non-binary. There are no simple solutions in these conversations. We have to like press the edges of what we know and then apply them to really push systems forward. I also want to make this an opportunity to learn with you and from you. I'm not coming as the sage on the stage. I'm coming sharing a problem of practice in one way that we are considering addressing it. There may be other better ways, and I might learn of them today from you. So what I'll share is ongoing work. It's continuing to form. We hope it does help us address this question of how to deal with measurement error at the individual student level, particularly when high stakes are associated with the outcomes. And we've been developing a policy that we have coined as proficient with evidence, which you see represented on the slide. In order to have this policy applied, students must have taken one of our other state summative assessments, which is our summative English language proficiency assessment, or ELPA, and earned proficient scores in every non-exempt domain except one. And that single domain where proficiency was not demonstrated must be within one conditional standard error of measure. I'll explain a little bit more of what that means in a second. I don't expect you to have caught all that yet. So our English language proficiency assessment is an assessment for students who are federally identified as English learners, meaning that they typically have a primary language that they have grown up with or learned outside of school. That is their first language, their native language. And when they come into the public school system, where the language of instruction is predominantly English, that can present some distinct hurdles. Our English language proficiency assessment helps determine whether students are ready to exit from English language development services, meaning they have built up their English skills sufficiently that they can access grade level content, grade level instruction that is delivered in English. So as part of our work at the Oregon Department of Education, we are really trying to rehumanize all of our assessment practices. This is kind of context or backdrop for you. We're really trying to pull student voice into the conversation, even in state summative assessment contexts. We are effectively eliminating high stakes use of summative assessment results as sole gatekeepers to student opportunity in our classrooms and in our schools and districts. And we are continuing to try to work on developing assessment literacy in practice with our educators, with our administrators, and of course with the general public as well. And there is no point at which you are automatically blessed and become assessment literate. It is always a work in progress, and there is always learning occurring. So the proposal that I briefly went through, I wanted to give you a little more detail around. So the proposal we have to submit to the U.S. Department of Education has to do with our English language proficiency assessment, which assesses speaking, listening, reading, and writing in English. So students who score proficient in all but one of those 4 areas. We also have exempt domains. So if a student is deaf, for example, they do not participate, or they don't have to participate in the speaking or listening portions of the assessment. That's one example. So if the student takes the portions, the domains of the assessment that they are required to participate in, and they're within one conditional standard error measure of that proficient cut score in that remaining domain, they are subject to the proficient with evidence requirement, which is what I'm going to explain now. And this is how we are trying to address measurement error in our practices. So what evidence is brought to bear to help inform this decision? So basically, we're in a situation where the test results can't really tell us whether this student is proficient and should exit, or this student may not be proficient and continues to need English language development services. We've built systems that put that test result in a stance of certainty when that test result cannot actually answer our question. It's a non-binary situation, right? Because the student's performance exists within that error band. So what we are proposing is that districts and schools bring additional evidence into the conversation for that particular sample of students who are very close, and so close that our tests actually can't tell us whether they made it over the proficient cut or not. So they can bring locally administered standardized tests, work samples, or local performance assessments. They can also use district developed or classroom level performance tasks or activities as part of the evidence that they bring into the conversation to help inform whether the student should be exited or actually should continue to receive services. So what comparison are we asking them to make? So we have achievement level descriptors that are part of our English language proficiency assessment design. Those describe what students should know and be able to do at each level of proficiency across the assessment. So what we are asking districts and practitioners to compare performance to from these classroom sourced evidence documentation is the proficient level. So do you have evidence that is derived from the classroom that the student is demonstrating reading skills at the proficient level when it was not clearly reflected on our state summative ELPA is one example of a question and a comparison that we're asking. So I already talked about a little bit of this. The evidence collected, there have to be at least 2 pieces per domain. One thing to really underscore the importance of is that the student's performance has to be independent, and we're going to have to get really clear in consultation with practitioners about what that looks like, what that feels like in the classroom. Because oftentimes in the classroom, educators are used to providing differentiated supports and scaffolding, which can interfere with the accuracy of the measurement. So that'll be a conversation that'll be interesting to have. Who gathers the evidence? We basically want everyone who is closest to the student being involved in the documentation process. This should actually already be happening as part of the natural course of instruction and the development of student portfolios across the year. But we do want people who understand the student's level of functioning best involved in that process. We, of course, also want those who aren't as closely impacted by the instructional process to be involved in the decision making. So who collects the evidence? Those closest to the student. Who decides whether that evidence aligns to the achievement level descriptors is 2 or more district personnel. And then for students experiencing disabilities, an additional staff member who has experience in special education is brought to bear. So that's a general education teacher, an English language development teacher, and then if the student also has a disability, a special education teacher are involved in making that decision. So in terms of evaluating the impact of this policy change, if we are able to bring it to bear in Oregon, looking at our extant data, over 2,600 students in Oregon across kindergarten through 12th grade might benefit from this policy based on last year's test results. The risk as far as the downside or the shadow side of the decision is minimal because students who may exit inappropriately, in other words, like false positives, will continue to be on monitoring status. Our system continues to watch how students who exit English language development services perform thereafter, and they can always come back in and receive services later if they were inappropriately identified for exit. It does, on the upside, promise to open windows of opportunity for some students to pursue other learning opportunities. So, for example, if they are in an English language development course, that means that they are not in a different course, such as electives, which could include music, drama, career technical education, etc. Finally, last 2 points, it incorporates measurement error into high stakes decision making, and that may have reach across other high stakes uses of assessments. We're not sure how that conversation will roll out. We also have other policies that we have put in place to support students. One is those is honoring high school proficiency, where we actually don't hold students to double jeopardy. If they take the test and passed it as a 9th grader in certain domains, they don't have to demonstrate that level of proficiency as a 10th grader, for example, in order to exit. So in conclusion, I can put a link to our current policy in the chat for you if you want to take a look at it in all of its detail. We got advice from our technical advisory committee that it's a really interesting policy, and they're looking forward to seeing what we learn, but that we should pilot it with a few willing districts first to see how well it plays out, to see what kinds of evidence are brought to bear, and then so that we can start curating and developing exemplars that future schools and districts could use. We also, of course, still have to adhere to the federal assessment requirements. So we have to have one standardized statewide entrance and exit procedure that is applied for all students in the state. So that is one of the reasons why we didn't look at conditional standard error of measure across all 4 domains, just one domain, is the capacity of our districts to be able to review that level of evidence was not present. And there is the policy itself. I'll put it in the chat for you if you want to take a peek. And I am now done.
And that's great. Thank you ever so much, Dan. Before I move on to Wendy, one quick question about the policy. What's the timetable? What's the time scale on which you're working?
Thanks, Jeff. So we are piloting this scoring policy in addition to our typical scoring practice, which is what counts for federal purposes this year. In the coming spring. So our test window runs from January through April. I think we have 4 districts who are interested in helping us with the pilot.
That's brilliant. How many kids would that involve?
Yeah, so at those 4 districts, we'll probably get close to 300 students who will be eligible for the process and work through it with us. Okay.
So thank you, Dan. We'll come back and as with Alli, I'll ask you to stay around as we move on to Wendy Choi, who's assessment manager at International Baccalaureate. She's going to give the 3rd of these presentations, after which we'll take a short Q&A session. So please use the chat room for any questions, comments, queries, challenges, and so on. And without further ado, Wendy, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Brilliant. Hello, Wendy. I'll hand over to you and be back at the end of your presentation. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you. I'm trying to turn on my video. I'm not sure if I need some help here, as seems I couldn't turn it on. Yep, there we go. So let me share my screen as well. So hello everyone, very happy to be presenting with you today and sharing about our pilot study. So today I'm going to talk a little bit more about peer-to-peer assessment and feedback, as we see feedback as a very integral process of assessment. And in the IB, we have moved beyond the simple division of talking about formative assessment and summative assessment. And we talk more about assessment as pedagogy in my area of work, because we think the use of assessment and feedback is so important as a pedagogical approach to support student learning. And today my presentation would be about how we use comparative judgment and as an approach to be sharing peer feedback and assessment. So as you know, I'm Wendy Choi. I'm the Learning in Assessment Manager at the IB. And so the whole idea behind this project is that we think for a student to develop from a novice learner to an expert learner, they also need to develop their evaluative judgment, meaning that they develop their ability to be assessing work. Because we realize that students who learn how to make good judgments about the quality of each other's work and give helpful feedback to each other, they also learn how to improve their own work. So when you're able to say whether this is a good piece of work, you're actually also able to use the same standards and criteria to improve your own work. So that's the whole idea behind our study. And so what we see is that a lot of research has already shown that students benefit a lot from quality feedback. And I think this resonates a lot with some of the earlier sections, both in this section and earlier today, that students really benefit from feedback in the assessment. But traditionally in a classroom, what happens is that a teacher might mark the essay or assessment that is completed by a student, and sometimes teachers would give quality feedback to the students. But very often what happens is that feedback is a one-way thing from the teacher to the student, and students usually would just get one piece of quality feedback from the teachers for one piece of work. But what we wanted to do in this pilot study was to use CJ, comparative judgment, as an approach to see whether we can multiply the amount of feedback that students get through engaging in peer feedback, and therefore enriching the feedback experience. But also one thing that we see very key in the IB classroom is student agency. So it's no longer just one-way thing, feedback going from the teacher to the students, but it's really more peer-to-peer feedback and students helping each other to learn. And this happens in a high school literature classroom. So what we did was, this was in DP literature, and students were learning to write guided texture analysis. So they were writing quite high-level analysis of these literary texts that they were reading, including both poetry and prose. And so what happened were they were trying to develop their very high order skills in terms of understanding interpretation, analysis, and evaluation. And this is just an extract of like 2 paragraphs from their samples, but usually students would write maybe up to 4 pages of a guided texture analysis. So what we did was we made use of some free platform, digital platform for comparative judgment. But since in the IB, we don't design these digital platforms ourselves, but what we designed in this pilot study was actually the pedagogical approach. itself. So I'm not going to talk so much about the digital platform that we use, but there's actually quite a few of free platforms that you can use if you want to try out this approach. But what happens is that quality is actually a very abstract thing. And so, for example, if I need to go shopping and I need to compare the quality of two like t-shirts, it's usually easier for me to say which one is better rather than giving an absolute judgment on this one. I'm going to give a mark of 0 to 10 on the quality of this t-shirt. So this is basically the idea behind comparative judgment. So it's easier for a student to be judging in comparison which quality is better in terms of two essays rather than putting an absolute mark on the essay. So that's the whole idea behind comparative judgment. So what we do was using the CJ platforms, students would be submitting the essays that they have done on the same text, and randomly the platform would be showing two scripts anonymously for students to be making judgments. And students only need to judge which, after reading the essays, which guided textual analysis is better in terms of understanding, interpretation, analysis, and evaluation. And of course, before making all these judgments, we need to give them the training in terms of what does it mean by in-depth analysis and evaluation, and how do they apply the criteria, for example. So like it's much simpler than learning to actually give marks to the essays. They only need to judge, after reading these two essays, I think I like the left one better, or I like the right one better in terms of the criteria. And of course, the most important, because we're talking about assessment as pedagogy, they're not just learning to make judgments here, but they have to learn to articulate why. Why is one better than the other? So the most important part is learning to give feedback. So if they say they like the piece on the left-hand side better, then they need to write feedback to their peer in terms of what they think was something that they like from the analysis, what was something they think that the student can further improve, and perhaps some feed forward in terms of what they think the student can do next to improve their piece. So that's basically how they would be doing judgments. And you can see that actually with lots of guidance and practice in terms of how to give feedback, students were really able to give very high quality feedback to each other. If you actually read some of these samples, I've just taken out some samples of the feedback they write to each other. You can see that they almost write just like an examiner would, and they give very detailed feedback in terms of where they think students were doing well, but also giving very detailed feed forward in terms of what they can do next to improve, and very concrete and constructive suggestions. So this is another example written by a student to other peers. It's all done anonymously, so students don't know who was giving feedback to them. But then what was interesting about this study was that rather than traditionally, if I'm a student and I've written an essay and I only get feedback from my teacher, in this exercise, every student would receive at least perhaps 10 quality feedback like this from 10 anonymous students, peer assessors. And so what happened was that the amount of feedback they received from students was multiplied, and they also learned to be giving feedback to each other in the process, and they were exposed to a large number of student essays that normally they wouldn't really get to read. So what we we found out the findings from this study was really encouraging, and throughout this process, students found that they were the feedback was really beneficial. And these are some of the things that students commenting that they found really beneficial or helpful to them. For example, being able to reflect on their own writing and analysis through giving feedback, reading a wide variety of student responses on the same text, receiving lots of personal, constructive, and timely feedback from their peers, practicing guided textual analysis and responding to different guiding questions, being exposed to high quality writing from their peers, reading some of the essays together as a class, and reviewing some of the feedback together as a class. So these are all what we felt made the study quite successful. And of course, as researchers, we don't want to just say the approach or the study was really successful simply by looking at the qualitative feedback. We also want to have a look at the numbers and see whether it's actually benefiting learning of the students. And actually looking at the numbers, it was also very encouraging for us. So students engage in 2 types of texts in this study, and we realized that there's significant improvement in both the poetry task and the prose task after engaging in using comparative judgment for sharing peer feedback. And you might say, but if it's just peer assessing each other, would there be a certain subjective element to it? And actually, it's not really actual improvement. So what we did was we also asked external examiners to be grading some of these essays anonymously. So they didn't know the order of the task, and we wanted to see whether there was an actual improvement in the task. And the results were also very encouraging. So both in terms of the actual marks, there was an increase from 6.8 from the first task to 9.2 in task 3 and task 4. And when this was made to the IB grade descriptors, we also saw a significant increase in the actual grades from 2 point something to almost 4. And so actually, it was both the quantitative and qualitative data told us that this was quite it was an innovative but also quite a positive approach for helping students to learn. And these are some of the feedback we got from students, because we want to make learning not just helping with their actual achievement and learning, but we also want to make the process interesting and fun for them. And so the best part of it was that students giving us feedback saying that this way of learning for them was really enjoyable. So for example, this student said they really enjoyed the study. It helped them to see each other's feedback and see how they can improve their writing. The learning experience was definitely needed, and they felt like this was the very first time they were able to do something like this, where they can learn from others, receive constructive criticism, and implement all of that into something greater to improve their writing skills. And this was another feedback from another student. The students felt they had made a lot of progress with their writing due to the great feedback they received from their peers. And they've learned how to analyze text in a much more thorough way and add more writing techniques to the writing. And so they even said it was a great experience and they would love to do it again. And actually what happened was we first piloted this with one high school in the United States in Minnesota, and with both DP1 and DP2 students. So they were grading each other's essays. It wasn't just for one grade. But then the school found that the study was so helpful to students that now they are actually partnering with other schools in their districts, and they're expanding the studies to more schools in their district. So yeah, this is just one of the quotes we have from the teachers that were piloting the study together. They mentioned that actually a lot of the students mentioned this, the great benefit of using peer feedback is quoting the quote, "A rising tide lifts all boats." So it's not just one student receiving feedback from the teacher and benefiting their own learning, but as students engage in collaborative learning and engage in peer feedback, then they all benefit from the results and they all improve their learning as a result. And this study actually won an award, the 100 Award on Formative Assessment Innovations. So if you'd like to learn more about that study, you can also go to the link here to see a bit. There's also a video posted about our study. And I think I will stop sharing here.
Okay, Wendy, thank you. Thank you ever so much. Now, don't mute. I shall ask you to rejoin us, and Dan and Alli as well, if you be so kind. We'll take a few questions. We've got about 5 or so minutes, if not a bit more. I'm just encourage everybody to use the chat area for any of your questions. Wendy, you actually had 2 really big concepts here. One is comparative judgment and one is peer-to-peer assessment, both of which I think are amazing tools. There's a question here from Jeff. Thanks, Wendy. That was great. Has the IB Baccalaureate looked at using comparative judgment for creating new questions, item types for its diploma career mid-years programs. Has it itself learnt the lessons from what your study has undertaken?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, but I don't think I will be able to answer that because my research is definitely more in the area of like formative feedback assessment as pedagogy. So what happens inside the classroom, the ongoing assessments. But definitely, I think there's been lots of research around using comparative judgment also for summative purpose. And but I'm not as familiar with that type of research. Okay.
I thought, and it was worth asking, and thank you, Jeff, for the question. If I could ask all three of you, I don't know who wants to take this first, but let's talk about what you've been doing in terms of feedback to stakeholders. What sort of reaction have you got? We've heard about the kids themselves, and maybe for those directly involved in this, but what about managers and school leaders? What about administrators? What about parents? Who would like to kick off? Dan's nodding his head, so I'm taking that as a volunteer.
I'll try. So of course, at the state level, reporting and interpreting test results during the pandemic has been a pretty massive challenge, just because we've had such low participation rates. We had no testing in 2020. We had limited testing in 2021, and now we're just starting to kind of, in Oregon, get students back into taking the state summative assessments at the end of the year. So it's been a pretty tremendous challenge. Sharing data, which we are obligated to do, we have to report aggregate data for all of our education and community partners. We also have to make sure that we put appropriate guardrails in place so that those data can't be weaponized against groups of students or schools. So one of the things that we'll do, and then I'd love to hear from everyone else. One of the things we did this year is I met with journalists prior to the announcement of our state assessment results, just to explain to them what our state assessment system is, how it's built, what it's designed to measure, what appropriate and inappropriate uses of the data look like, how their headlines actually can harm schools and continue to perpetuate inequities. If we start thinking of schools that are actually serving our neediest students as bad schools, that convinces people not to move there, people of means not to move there, for example. So those kinds of impacts, I don't know that they had really thought about before. And we did see a kind of a change in the tenor in most of the journalism that we saw after that presentation. I can't attribute it all, of course, to that, but that's really what we are leaning into is trying to disrupt the weaponization of those data once they are made public. That's been a pretty massive challenge.
Well, yes, I like, or do I mean dislike, the idea of weaponization of the information, because it can be used in many ways. Alli, any view about how we engage with and explain ourselves to stakeholders?
I think from a classroom teacher perspective is again, it starts very early on with how you kind of present the learning environment, and how to, again, going back to my presentation, is like how do we use the tests and assessments to move us forward, rather than like focus on where students are at in that moment of time, because it doesn't predict future success. And I think when you're talking to administrators, counselors, parents, anybody involved in that learning journey, is creating that dialogue of like, how do we move ourselves forward? How do we get interested in the learning and and move beyond a test score or letter grade, and having parents buy into that, then it matriculates outside into the community as well. Because if they're bought into, like, we don't need to be so test heavy. I don't think parents and the community members understand how much power they have in really that conversation, is if they are invested in the learning versus a test score, how transformative that could be, and the ripple effects from that as well. So I think the more those conversations are cultivated early on, and it can really create more dialogues for changing the testing environment on a bigger scale.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm just going to ask Wendy, because I saw her nodding then, whether she wants to come in on any of that.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with what both of you have mentioned. Like engaging stakeholder are so important, and I think that's what some of our schools mentioned. Sometimes at a district level or state level, sometimes when we talk about formative assessment, there's still a lot of reporting that needs to be done, like reporting on marks and grades. While we definitely want to move beyond that, because we think the quality of the feedback is more important than just the grades and marks itself. And therefore, using research studies like this, we try to demonstrate to stakeholders, both parents, but then also at the district level, administrators, that actually it works when you give feedback to each other. You don't always need just a grade or marks on things. And I think in this study, it was quite successful in the sense that the district administrators did see that it works, and that's why they were able to engage more schools at the district level now. Yeah, interesting. If I could, you mentioned now at the end of that, Wendy, and if I could pick up from Dan mentioned the P word, pandemic. I wonder how all three of you feel in terms of pessimism and optimism about the future as we come out of the pandemic. Do you think we've had gains as well as losses, and do you think we'll hold on to those gains? Who wants to kick off? Alli?
I would say so. Something that came to light when the pandemic, we were full throttle in it, is somebody pointed out, when Hurricane Katrina came in 2005-06, and there was no school for those kids for a year. I mean, it was even more detrimental to the educational system. And now they've looked at those students, 10, 15 years out, and they're just fine. And so we all went through a collective shift, and yes, it changed a lot of things, but I don't think the long-term effects are going to impede learning and testing. It's a data point. It's not the full longevity of learning.
Okay, Dan.
Yeah, I would add, I'm super optimistic. I mean, one thing that's true that was part of our communications this year is we're not measuring everything that students learned, right? We're certainly not reporting everything that students learned. So there's a lot of learning that occurred during the pandemic that you're not going to see reflected in any of the state assessments or national assessments that are available. And those are all like really important adaptive skills that students are going to need, not just to suffer through another pandemic, which I hope doesn't happen again, but just to be able to be present, to be socially, emotionally supportive for each other, to understand that learning is a process and that you have to just keep making mistakes and keep moving forward. I think that was reinforced for teachers who had to learn a new way of meeting an instructional challenge. That was reinforced for administrators who had to also learn how to support teachers in a totally new environment. I don't think we're going to lose any of that knowledge, and it's not reflected in the data that you're seeing in the headlines right now.
Yeah.
So I'm not worried about it at all. In fact, recovery in states that are really able to lean back into in-person learning is kind of doubled what I would have expected. So I think the future looks bright. We're just not looking in the right spots.
It's interesting. And I'm going to finish now with Wendy with her view of optimistic, pessimistic. How do you sit as the researcher?
Yeah, as researchers, we always say there's both good and bad, right? Actually, for our study, we kind of have like designed and implemented the study like during the pandemic. So it's really like with digital platforms, with social media and all that it made it possible for us to be collaborating with students and teachers in the United States in the study. So definitely, I think the pandemic has shown us that actually with lots of digital technology, we're able to do lots of very interesting assessment and learning now that previously without these digital platforms we're not able to do. But then of course I think our students always enjoyed that actual face-to-face interaction. So there's part of that they do on the digital platform. They make judgments anonymously, but then they always enjoy being in the group and actually discussing about the feedback or discussing about their work. So I think we do need both.
Good. I'm going to get in trouble for overrunning, but I'll just ask you for sort of a positive, positive thumbs up or thumbs down on it. I get the sense that students, the kids themselves, actually are quite happy to embrace the new thinking and new ways of working, and actually they welcome, in many ways, things like peer-to-peer review and so on. Do I get a quick thumbs up from everybody to finish the morning? Brilliant. That's just what I like to see. So thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Alli. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, our other speakers this morning. It's been a fascinating half day. We've covered an awful lot of ground. We will now take a break and return at 12:45 Eastern, give everybody a chance to do those dreaded emails and everything and messages and all those other things that have been piling up while we've been chatting today. We'll just take a quick break. I think I'm actually able to share. Yeah.